Hello and welcome to my newest video. Today I'd like to talk with everybody about a favorite subject of mine which occurred to me recently, and that's taking life for granted. The assumption on my part is that anybody that views my videos are essentially on a search for meaning, a search for understanding, consciousness, spirituality, however it is that you wish to term it. And one of the greatest stumbling blocks that we can have on this path is taking so many of the things in life for granted, and we as humans seem to do that. How often do you notice the flower, the flight of a butterfly, the movement of a bird, how the wind moves through the trees, a simple raindrop? How many of you take yourselves for granted? And I think most people do. When we take things for granted, we really overlook, for the most part, the real value of living, being a human, and the true value of ourselves. Let me see if I can share with you some ideas on why taking things for granted is possibly not the best. Let's say in your childhood you have parents that to you have been unkind to you. Um, what we end up doing with that, if they downplay us, let's say do something like call us stupid all the time, or foolish, or imaginative, or whatever, we end up as human as we grow in life taking those sorts of comments from our parents for granted. And then taking it for granted, we end up basically thinking that's how we are. When in reality we really aren't. I remember in Nepal, it was late fall, I believe, um, when I was at the monastery in Kyoto, which is about 75 miles north of Kathmandu. And I realized the truth of what was just shared with you, that I had my dad's view of myself. And once I had that understanding, I decided to change that view because that view wasn't me. And what a lot of us don't realize is that we can change any of those views at any given time by simply changing our own minds and viewing us through our own eyes by not taking ourselves for granted. You see, if you take yourself for granted, we become blind to the truth of ourselves. In fact, you could say we become blind to virtually everything in life. So to me, taking things for granted is a huge detriment, especially on the path of consciousness. And after all, some of the greatest wisdom from the ancients that was ever left to us was the idea of knowing ourselves. How can we ever know ourselves when what we know is what we take for granted all the time? Um, if a person thinks that they're foolish and they grow up with that, they're constantly hearing that, then they're going to end up thinking themselves as foolish and consequently will always be doing foolish things. How many of you actually really just stop and smell a fresh bloom flower? What are those words that say, take the time to smell a flower? In other words, if we're taking life for granted, we're going to overlook some of the most amazing things that I think we ever could. One day, just as an example, I was out in my backyard and I saw what I, as a child, used to refer to as an ant war. In other words, it was all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ants just swarming all over the place, seemingly at each other. And what I had done is I had squatted down in the yard and I was just basically observing them, watching them, attempting to see what it was that they were doing with each other. And after about 15 minutes, I came back into the house, and my lovely lady looked at me and says, "Stephen, what were you looking at?" And I shared with her the idea of the ants. And wonderfully enough, she herself decided she wanted to go out and see. And she herself observed them for quite a period of time. You see, most people would walk around that or just keep going and never even notice that anything is even happening. You see, when we do that, I think we miss the true beauty of life, the true idea of acceptance of who we are, what we're about. You know, we all take for granted. Look at something as simple as water or even our atmosphere, the air, whatever. For hundreds of years, we took for granted that water was plentiful. It's just wasn't simply everywhere. Well, look what we've done to it because of the idea of taking it for granted. Look at what we've done to our own atmosphere, the very things that keep us alive as people. Why have we done it? Because we simply took it for granted. and what we did to it would have no impact. Oh, really? Take a look. Science is now saying we have a huge impact, or as they also say, we're leaving a huge footprint. Well, that's fine. That's simply the way that it is at the moment. But I do think we're coming to the point of realizing that life is not something that we can take for granted. I mean, when you even take a relationship for granted, what is the reason for that relationship? We all always assume that person is always going to be there. And by taking them for granted, we do not necessarily treat them possibly the best that we could. That we're always giving them that love, showing them that affection, or offering that kind word. We even take conversations with people for granted. And what happens? We don't really listen to them. Even if we look at the world today, for the most part, who really listens to anybody else? Very few. Why? Because I feel deeply that we take our experiences completely for granted. How can we take experience for granted? That's always been a real curiosity to me, because to me, life is an amazing thing. You see, everyone would look at life differently if we took absolutely nothing for granted. No single human, if we took no single idea of wildlife, any idea of Mother Nature. I mean, for heaven's sakes, over the last few days, it's been raining in our area. And to me, it's just fun noticing those clouds and seeing them, how they move across the sky without taking any of that for granted. To me, that's how we really experience who we are. After all, we were given physical form, we were given life to give us the idea of experience. And if we're always taking that experience for granted, then I have to ask you, what is it that any of us are really experiencing? I don't think it can be all that much, and at least for certain, without question, it won't come across as being special. Why? Because we always take it for granted. Even in the way that we live, we take all of those experiences for granted. And the reason we do that is because we think all experiences are always the same. Well, I have news for you. No, they're not. Every experience, when we look at them appropriately, is a new adventure, at least to me. And even at my age and all that I've seen and been through in my life, and that includes from living in monasteries, studying as a monk, being in a combat zone, studying with the Zens, whether it be the Native American traditions in the Cree or the Blackfeet nations. I've had the opportunity to share time with these wonderful people and learn to understand their philosophical ideas of life and how life, all of them have always talked about just how special it is, with the exception, of course, of a combat zone. That one's not included, but even in its own way, yes, it is. Because, see, I found in a combat zone that you just couldn't take your perpetuation in a continuous manner. You know, there's a philosophy in the Far East that basically says that each of us are allocated a certain number of breaths. And when we've used that last breath, there are simply no more. There are none left. And you see, none of us know what that number is, whether it's within ourselves or within another human. Now, we could look at that one of two ways. We could say, wow, that's kind of a negative way to look at life. Or we can look at it from a different direction and learn to have a greater level of appreciation for life. That's what we could do for certain if we so chose. You see, taking it all for granted, that means life now doesn't mean all that much. And the biggest thing that we actually do when we start taking things like that for granted is we tend to latch onto our yesterdays or yesteryears, and we remember those. And all of those ideas, all they simply do is take us out of the present moment. You see, experience occurs then. And the question I've always had, if experience occurs in that present moment, how in the world can we end up taking that for granted? Because when we take it for granted, we miss the true depth of the experience that we have in front of us. I love each morning when my lady and I get up and prepare for our day, and how we start each day with just a simple hug. And we just stand there and hug each other and feel that and share in that experience without ever taking it for granted. And every morning, even though I know we're going to do that, it just has just such special circumstances and such special meaning to me, because I simply don't take it for granted. You see, one day, if we take that relationship for granted, we end up finding that person gone. Why? because we took it so much for granted, we forgot how we were treating that person. For every person that this individual encounters in life, it has a very special connotation to it. Why? Because they are a unique expression of their divine being. How in the world can any of us take that for granted? Yet so many of us tend to want to do that. That almost anymore seems to me to be more automatic than anything. Now, how can we live life automatically? Ironically, most of us do. We are on automatic pilot because we just simply take too much for granted. Heck, let's say you leave your house in the morning, you take for granted that because you always drive the same way when you go to work, the very same route. And unfortunately for you, one morning you get up and nobody notified you that they're going to be working on your streets and you had to take a different route because you can no longer take the way you've always gone for granted. You run into levels of impatience or irritation simply because um, you've always taken the route that you do for granted, and you aren't experiencing anything new in any given moment when that's what the experiences of life is actually all about. Is always new experiences. How can you have new experiences if you're taking it all for granted in your repetitive thoughts and in your repetitive behavior and your repetitive workaday world? And some of that's fine. In the workaday world, I can understand it. But when it comes to actually living, when it comes to actually being you, we are actually a lot more spontaneous than most people would ever realize and or even recognize. After all, how could you and how can we if we're always taking whatever we're doing for granted? If you take for granted what someone else is going to say, are you really going to hear what they have to say? That response is actually no. You see, that's how much taking things for granted can override our day-to-day living. Oh, sure, there are some things that I feel, philosophically speaking, that we could indeed take for granted. One, hey, the sun comes up every morning and goes down every evening. That, but still, don't take it so much for granted that you don't notice the beauty of the sunrise or the sunset and how the reflection of those colors bounce off the clouds that are in the sky. Or how when it's setting behind the mountains, in my case, that you get those different rays and hues that come off those mountains as the sun goes down behind them or rises in front of them. You see, the part that you can take for granted is the fact that it's going to come up and it's going to set until, of course, it's no more, if that ever occurs. Doubtful, no matter what anybody says, December the 21st or otherwise. And speaking of December the 21st, what if we take it all for granted that the world's going to end? What if we take it all for granted that we're going to continue and be around on 22nd, 24th, and be able to experience the Christmas of this year? The point is when we do take things for granted, it has so many overlapping ideas that can intertwine themselves into our day-to-day living and in our day-to-day actions. Don't ever take you for granted. Don't take life for granted because you never know when that last breath is going to be the last one that you're going to have. If you can learn to live in that manner, then you become a very special creature to yourself, and your life actually takes on very special connotations. It's all in how you see it, and that's the idea of what living consciously is actually all about. It's not taking things for granted. That you are a special person. And in fact, you're only one of a kind. That's how special each of us are. Oh, sure, we all look alike, except for possibly our external paint jobs or the fact that we're feminine or have different colored eyes. But the fact is, internally, we are all exactly alike. Externally, essentially, yes, we have two eyes, two ears, mouth, nose, two arms, legs, hands, and we take all of that specialness for granted without ever realizing what makes all of this operate and work together. Oh my. That you could consider as a miracle in and of itself. How can we take something so magnificent, so much for granted? But once more, there are some things. Things like, let's say, if you are manifesting, and the truth is, we all do it, we all create our lives in every single moment. You can take for granted if you're manifesting, let's say, a greater monetary return or a relationship. Um, you can take for granted that the occurrence of those events are going to take place, and that's only an element of when. So that I would say, yes, you can take for granted. Here's how it can play a trick on you, though, when you're working on manifesting something. Let's say you're attempting to work on manifesting a relationship, and you have the whole idea of this person, the color of their hair, their height, their weight, their career, whatever, and you have it all together in your mind. And then one day, whether you're a male or a female, you happen to encounter the exact match of everything you want to manifest. You are going to be in seventh heaven. Your heart is going to be pounding. You're going to be feeling all of that energy that's flowing between the two of you. And then the thing that you took for granted and the thing that you overlooked all of a sudden stops you in your tracks because you forgot in your manifestation that they had to be single, that they weren't married. You find out that this person you just had this encounter with is married. Why? Because you took for granted in your creation of this relationship that the person was going to be single. Don't do that. If you're going to take something for granted, make sure you understand what it is, and then understand without any analysis why you're taking it for granted. We can all take for granted that we can drive a car. But if that's true, why are there so many accidents on the highway? Are people taking so much for granted that they just simply aren't paying attention and they collide with another vehicle? Probably. I mean, if it's on a heavy snowstorm and you're driving on the highway and you take for granted that your driving is fine, well, that's great. But what about that other person that runs into you because you didn't give them enough room or they didn't give you enough room? You took it all for granted. So my point is when we take everything for granted in the manner that I'm talking about, we have the propensity to overlook so much in the way of detail about something. I was taught as a monk that detail is the most important aspect. Why? Because it's the detail that always makes up the whole scene, the whole idea of the person, whatever the case may be. And it's those details, it's those small nuances, it's the subtleties that give you everything. It's the fragrance of that flower. That's the subtle detail of it. It's the beauty of that flower. That's the magnificence of being. By not accepting the idea that we can take everything for granted, because even when you do that, even in the idea of manifesting, it's not necessarily the best path that you can take. So my first suggestion is, again, if you're going to take something for granted, at least still pay attention to the basic subtleties of what's going on. And when you start doing that, then you cannot necessarily take everything for granted, especially, and the most important thing out of this entire video is yourself. The way your mind operates, the way your heart operates, all of the things you feel, think, say, and show and do. Don't take any of that for granted, because you could indeed have the overlap of other people running around in your mind and how they see you. And when you do that, you become the very thing that everybody else says you are. Well, you're not. You are something totally different. So just simply understand that. You are a unique expression of divine. Your fingerprint says so, your DNA says so, the iris of your eyes say so. But other than that, live your life through what you understand about you and make sure that you establish your own view of you. Don't think you're unlovable and take that for granted just because your parents didn't love you. That's not even relevant anymore. That's just simply the way it was. I found in my own personal experience, because of the lack of love that I actually experienced from my parents, it was a long time in my life that I honestly felt I was just an unlovable person, so why even bother? Well, that led me down an interesting path, which certainly ultimately ended up awakening me that I am lovable and I am quite capable of loving and giving my heart and allowing people into my heart, friends, my own bride, children, whoever. So I found that my parents only knew what they knew and did the best that they could in their own manner. And I also realized that my parents were both probably in a greater level of pain than I ever was in my life. I found that to be an extremely freeing experience, and because of that, I never, since that time, took myself for granted. I established my own view, my own mind, my own thoughts, my own understanding of me. After all, if you really think about it, who knows you the best? Only you. Who can lie to themselves? I'm not certain anybody really can. Because when we're telling a lie, here's something funny, you always have to think of the truth first. Why? Because if you don't think of the truth first, then you don't know what to lie about. And besides, if you're attempting to live a lie, I can make you a promise. The truth is always going to come out, and there's nothing you can do about that. So why live the lie in the first place? If you find yourself diminishing you, what you're doing is just taking yourself for granted. And it's also another message from your soul letting you know that you just simply have other people's views of you. That's not your view. I can make you a promise that if one day you do listen to this video, or if you do pick up one of my books, a metaphysical interpretation of the Bible, or the 12 sacred principles of karma, they will have an impact. And I've had so many people tell me that they learn to become more loving, more understanding, more giving. They realize the returns of what life is all about. And if we take it for granted, we will never have any idea of what life is going to return to us. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Stephen Hairfield, Dr. Stephen Hairfield. If you'd like to find out more about me, please visit my website at www.hairfield.com. I do appreciate your comments, either for or against it. To me, that's fine. That's just your own individuality. And I do not take those for granted. I think they're pretty special. So with that being said, I hope you guys have a wonderful and loving day. And I'd like to ask you to do yourselves a favor. Why not go for 1 week without taking anything for granted whatsoever, and see if it doesn't shift your perspective of not only yourself, but life and the way it's lived. Shanti Satyam in India, that just simply means peaceful truth. Thank you.